Part 1, The Funeral Secret. The most dangerous secrets are not hidden in wills, they are hidden in the people waiting to hear them. 3 days after my husband Theodore's funeral, the Whitmore estate felt unusually quiet. The steady stream of visitors had finally slowed, the sympathy cards had stopped arriving, and the large historic house in Connecticut seemed to be settling into a silence that made every room feel larger than before. I spent most of that morning in the library, sitting beside the tall windows that overlooked the oak trees Theodore had planted decades earlier. Grief has a strange way of changing time. Some moments pass quickly, while others seem to linger forever. I was staring at the garden when I heard a soft knock on the door. Before I could answer, my granddaughter Lily stepped inside. At 12 years old, she was thoughtful beyond her years, and the expression on her face immediately caught my attention. She looked nervous. She closed the door behind her and walked toward me. Then she lowered her voice almost to a whisper. "Grandma, I think Mom is hiding something." For a moment, I simply looked at her. Children occasionally misunderstand adult conversations, so I chose my next words carefully. "Why would you think that, sweetheart?" Lily hesitated before answering. The night before Grandpa's funeral, I heard Mom talking on the phone in her room. She sounded upset. She kept saying that everything had to go according to plan and that after the will reading things would finally work out. A faint feeling of concern settled in my chest. Vanessa had always cared deeply about appearances, status, and financial security. Yet this was not the time to jump to conclusions. "Did she say anything else?" I asked gently. Lily shook her head. "Not really." But she sounded different. Almost like she was worried about something. I thanked Lily for telling me and assured her that she had done the right thing. After she left, I remained seated for a long time. Vanessa's behavior during the past week suddenly seemed more noticeable in hindsight. During the funeral reception, she had spent surprisingly little time speaking about Theodore. Instead, she appeared distracted, frequently checking messages and holding private conversations with various people. At first I assumed she was simply overwhelmed. Now I was not so sure. Later that afternoon, several family members gathered in the dining room. Vanessa arrived wearing an elegant cream-colored outfit, perfectly composed despite the circumstances. She smiled politely, accepted condolences gracefully, and carried herself with the confidence she always displayed in public. Yet as I watched her interact with relatives, I noticed something beneath the surface. Every time someone mentioned Theodore's estate, her attention sharpened immediately. Every reference to the upcoming will reading seemed to interest her more than any memory of the man we had lost. 2 days later, the family attorney contacted us. The official reading of Theodore's will was scheduled for the following morning. The news spread quickly through the family. Reactions ranged from curiosity to anxiety. Vanessa appeared especially attentive, though she tried not to show it. That evening, while organizing some of Theodore's personal belongings, I discovered a sealed envelope tucked inside the drawer of his desk. Written across the front in Theodore's unmistakable handwriting were a few simple words. "To be opened immediately after the will is read." As I stared at the envelope, an uneasy feeling settled over me. Something told me that the next day would change far more than anyone expected. Part 2, The Reading Everyone Expected. The following morning arrived with the kind of grey sky that seemed appropriate for unfinished grief. A light rain fell over Connecticut as family members gathered at the downtown office of Theodore Whitmore's longtime attorney. The conference room was spacious and elegant, with dark wood walls and large windows overlooking the city. I arrived early and took a seat near the end of the table. One by one, relatives entered the room, greeting each other quietly as they settled into their chairs. Vanessa arrived a few minutes later beside my son. She looked perfectly composed, dressed in a tailored navy blue outfit with every detail carefully arranged. To anyone else, she appeared calm and respectful. Yet after Lily's warning and everything I had observed during the previous week, I found myself paying closer attention. As people exchanged memories about Theodore, Vanessa smiled politely but rarely contributed. Instead, her eyes frequently drifted toward the attorney's folder resting on the table. Eventually the attorney entered the room carrying several documents. The conversation stopped immediately. He offered condolences and thanked everyone for attending before explaining that Theodore's estate plan had been updated several years earlier and reflected his final wishes. A noticeable tension settled over the room. Although no one said it aloud, everyone understood that moments like this often revealed unexpected truths about families. The attorney began reading. At first, everything sounded exactly as most people expected. Theodore had made generous provisions for various charitable organizations that had been important to him throughout his life. Several longtime employees received meaningful gifts in recognition of their years of service and loyalty. Family heirlooms were distributed thoughtfully among relatives. As each section was read, heads nodded around the room. Nothing seemed unusual. Vanessa appeared increasingly relaxed. I noticed her posture becoming more confident with each passing minute. When the attorney began discussing the larger financial assets of the estate, several family members leaned forward attentively. Theodore had accumulated substantial wealth during his lifetime through business ventures, investments, and real estate holdings. Most people naturally assumed that the majority would pass directly to his immediate family. As the details unfolded, it initially appeared that assumption was correct. Significant assets were allocated for the benefit of my son and future generations of the Whitmore family. Vanessa maintained a composed expression, but I could sense her satisfaction growing. Even Lily seemed to notice. The attorney continued reading for nearly an hour. By that point, many relatives looked relieved. The process appeared straightforward. Theodore's wishes seemed fair, organized, and entirely predictable. The atmosphere in the room gradually relaxed. Several people exchanged quiet smiles. One cousin even whispered that Theodore had planned everything exactly as expected. Then the attorney turned to the final section of the document. His tone changed slightly. He adjusted his glasses and glanced around the room before speaking. There is one additional provision that Mr. Whitmore instructed me to discuss separately. The room became silent again. Vanessa's smile faded almost immediately. The attorney opened another folder that had remained closed throughout the meeting. Several portions of the estate, he continued, have been placed into a specially structured family trust governed by conditions established personally by Mr. Whitmore. Confused expressions appeared throughout the room. This was clearly not information anyone had anticipated. The attorney explained that substantial assets would not transfer directly to individual beneficiaries in the traditional manner everyone expected. Instead, specific requirements and oversight provisions had been established. I watched Vanessa carefully. For the first time that morning, genuine uncertainty appeared in her expression. Whatever outcome she had anticipated, this was not it. Before anyone could ask questions, the attorney raised a hand. "There is more," he said. Mr. Whitmore also left written instructions explaining exactly why these provisions were created. My thoughts immediately returned to the sealed envelope waiting at the estate. Theodore had known this moment was coming. And as the attorney prepared to reveal the next part of his final plan, I began to realize that the reading everyone expected was only the beginning. Part 3, Theodore's final condition. For several seconds after the attorney mentioned the family trust, nobody spoke. The room that had gradually relaxed during the earlier reading suddenly felt tense again. Outside the conference room windows, rain continued falling across the city, tapping softly against the glass. The attorney opened another document and began explaining Theodore's final arrangements in greater detail. Mr. Whitmore believed that wealth should support family relationships rather than replace them, he said. For that reason, a significant portion of the estate has been placed into a trust that will be managed according to specific guidelines. Several relatives exchanged puzzled looks. My son leaned forward slightly. Vanessa sat perfectly still. The confidence that had been building throughout the morning was now noticeably absent. The attorney continued. The trust would provide financial security for future generations of the Whitmore family, but access to certain assets would not be unrestricted. Funds designated for education, health, family development, charitable projects, and long-term stability would remain protected. Major distributions would require oversight from appointed trustees and would need to align with the values Theodore had outlined before his death. A murmur spread quietly around the room. This was not the type of inheritance structure most people expected. Theodore had not simply distributed money. He had created a system designed to guide how it would be used long after he was gone. One cousin raised a hand and asked the question everyone seemed to be thinking. Why would he do that? The attorney glanced at his notes before answering. Mr. Whitmore was very clear. He believed that money, when left without purpose, could sometimes create division rather than unity. He wanted his legacy to strengthen family bonds rather than weaken them. I found myself smiling faintly. The explanation sounded exactly like Theodore. Throughout our marriage, he often spoke about responsibility, gratitude, and stewardship. To him, wealth had always been a tool, never the destination. Across the table, however, Vanessa appeared increasingly unsettled. She remained polite and composed, but subtle signs betrayed her disappointment. Her jaw tightened slightly. Her fingers rested motionless against the table. Every new detail seemed to make it clearer that the inheritance she expected would not arrive in the form she had imagined. The attorney spent nearly 20 minutes explaining the structure. The trust would ensure financial support for family members, but it would also encourage involvement, accountability, and shared decision-making. Theodore had carefully designed every provision. By the end of the explanation, it was obvious that no single person would exercise complete control over the assets. The room remained silent as everyone processed the information. Some relatives seemed impressed. Others appeared confused. Vanessa looked as though she were recalculating everything she had expected from the day. Finally, my son asked whether Theodore had left any explanation beyond the legal documents. The attorney nodded. Yes. In fact, he anticipated that many of you would ask exactly that question. He reached into his folder and removed another sealed envelope. The sight immediately caught my attention because it reminded me of the letter waiting back at the estate. Theodore had clearly prepared multiple messages. This document contains Mr. Whitmore's personal explanation, the attorney said. He instructed me to present it only after everyone understood the structure of the trust. Vanessa's eyes fixed on the envelope. Several family members shifted forward in their seats. Whatever Theodore had written, it was important enough for him to place alongside his final legal instructions. The attorney carefully broke the seal but did not begin reading immediately. Instead, he looked around the room one final time. Before I continue, he said quietly, you should understand that Mr. Whitmore wanted this message to be heard by every member of the family together. A strange feeling settled over me. Theodore had always been thoughtful, but this level of preparation suggested something deeper. As the attorney unfolded the letter and prepared to read the first line, I realized that the inheritance itself was no longer the most important story unfolding in that room. The real story was about to begin. Part 4, The Letter That Changed Everything. The attorney unfolded Theodore's letter carefully and adjusted the pages in front of him. The conference room remained completely silent. Outside, the rain continued falling against the windows, but inside, every eye was fixed on the document that Theodore had prepared long before any of us imagined this day would arrive. The attorney cleared his throat and began reading. To my family, if you are hearing these words, then I am no longer with you. First, I want each of you to know how deeply I loved you. Every decision I made regarding this estate was guided by that love. The opening words immediately sounded like Theodore. Warm, thoughtful, and direct. Several family members smiled softly as familiar memories surfaced. The attorney continued. Throughout my life, I learned that wealth can be a blessing when it serves people, but a burden when people begin serving it. Money can solve many problems, but it cannot create character, trust, gratitude, or love. Those must be built through daily choices. I listened carefully. Around the room, relatives appeared thoughtful. Even Vanessa remained attentive. Theodore's message was not harsh. It sounded more like a grandfather sharing wisdom than a businessman discussing finances. Then the letter became more personal. Over the past several years, I have watched our family grow. I have seen remarkable achievements, successful careers, beautiful homes, and impressive accomplishments. I am proud of many things. However, I have also observed something that concerns me. The atmosphere in the room shifted immediately. People exchanged brief glances. The attorney continued reading. I have noticed moments when status seemed more important than connection. Moments when appearances received more attention than relationships. Moments when success was measured by what people owned rather than by how they treated one another. No names were mentioned, yet the words landed heavily. Vanessa's posture became noticeably more rigid. My son stared down at the table. Several relatives avoided eye contact altogether. Theodore had always been observant. Far more observant than most people realized. The attorney paused briefly before reading the next section. The trust was created because I want future generations of this family to understand that inheritance is not simply about receiving wealth. It is about accepting responsibility. If money arrives without values attached to it, then eventually both the money and the values may disappear. I felt a quiet sense of admiration. Even in his final message, Theodore was trying to protect the family rather than control it. Then came the passage that changed everything. There is one particular memory I have carried with me during my final years. It involved an event that occurred several months ago. Most people present probably did not realize how much it affected me, but it revealed something important about priorities. The room instantly grew tense. Vanessa's eyes widened slightly. For the first time all morning, genuine concern appeared on her face. The attorney continued. That day showed me how easy it is for adults to become distracted by recognition, achievement, and public image while overlooking the people who need them most. It reminded me that family should never be treated as a secondary obligation. Several relatives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. I immediately wondered which event Theodore was referring to. Whatever had happened, it clearly left a lasting impression on him. The attorney lowered the page momentarily before continuing. I do not share this memory to criticize anyone. People make mistakes. I certainly made many of my own. I share it because growth begins with honesty, and families become stronger when they are willing to recognize what truly matters. The room remained silent. Vanessa looked increasingly unsettled. It was obvious she suspected the memory somehow involved her, though she could not yet be certain. Finally, the attorney reached the last paragraph. If you are wondering why I structured the trust this way, the answer is simple. I want my family to inherit more than money. I want them to inherit perspective. I want them to choose relationships over appearances, presence over prestige, and love over status whenever those choices become difficult. As the attorney finished reading, nobody spoke. The message had touched everyone differently. Yet one sentence lingered in my mind more than any other. Theodore had mentioned a specific incident. A moment that had convinced him something needed to change. And as I looked across the table at Vanessa, I realized that whatever memory Theodore had carried all those months was about to become impossible to ignore. Part 5, The Truth Comes Out. For several moments after the attorney finished reading Theodore's letter, nobody moved. The silence felt heavier than anything that had been said so far. Theodore's words had landed exactly as he intended. They were not accusations, yet they forced everyone in the room to examine themselves. I looked around the conference table and saw thoughtful expressions everywhere. Some relatives appeared reflective. Others looked uncomfortable. Vanessa sat perfectly still, her gaze fixed on the table in front of her. The attorney carefully set the letter aside and folded his hands. There is one final note attached to this section, he said. Mr. Whitmore specifically referenced an event that influenced his decision-making process. He did not identify individuals by name, but he believed those present would understand the significance. A faint feeling of recognition stirred in my memory. Suddenly, I knew exactly which event Theodore had been describing. It had happened 8 months earlier during Lily's middle school recognition ceremony. the school had invited families to celebrate students who demonstrated leadership, kindness, and academic dedication throughout the year. Lily had been incredibly excited. She spent weeks preparing for the event and talking about it whenever she visited the estate. Theodore attended proudly. I attended proudly. Nearly every family member attended. Vanessa arrived as well, but her attention seemed divided from the beginning. As I remembered that afternoon, the details became painfully clear. During the reception after the ceremony, Lily had repeatedly tried to show her mother the certificate she received. Each time, Vanessa responded briefly before returning to conversations about business opportunities with several guests. At one point, Lily stood nearby holding her certificate while Vanessa discussed a potential partnership with impressive enthusiasm. Theodore had noticed the entire interaction. I remembered seeing him watch quietly from across the room. Back then, I assumed he would forget about it. Apparently he never did. One of my cousins broke the silence. I think I know the event he meant, she said carefully. Another relative nodded. I was there too. The room became increasingly uncomfortable. Nobody was trying to embarrass Vanessa, yet several people clearly remembered similar moments. An aunt spoke next. There were other occasions as well. Not just that day. Vanessa slowly looked up. Her expression revealed uncertainty mixed with growing concern. What do you mean? She asked quietly. The question hung in the air for a moment. Finally, my son answered with surprising honesty. Dad loved this family more than anything. I think he worried that some of us were becoming too busy to notice what mattered most. Vanessa stared at him. Then she glanced toward me. Nobody sounded angry. Nobody sounded judgmental. That somehow made the conversation even more difficult. Several relatives began sharing memories. Small moments. Ordinary moments. Times when family gatherings became secondary to professional obligations. Times when achievements received more attention than relationships. None of the stories sounded dramatic on their own. Yet together they painted a picture that was impossible to ignore. Throughout the discussion, Theodore's concerns became increasingly understandable. He had not changed the structure of the inheritance because of a single event. The event had simply confirmed a pattern he had quietly observed over time. Vanessa listened without interrupting. The confidence she carried into the meeting that morning had completely disappeared. For the first time, she seemed less concerned about the trust and more concerned about what everyone was saying. Then something unexpected happened. A chair shifted softly near the far end of the table. Everyone turned toward Lily. Until that moment, she had remained silent throughout the entire meeting. Her eyes moved between the adults before finally settling on her mother. There was no anger in her expression. Only sadness and nervous determination. She took a slow breath and folded her hands together. The room became completely silent once again. Whatever Lily was about to say, it was clear she had been carrying it inside her for a very long time. Part 6. The words that hurt most. The door closed softly behind Vanessa, and for several moments nobody moved. The rain outside continued tapping against the windows of the attorney's office, but inside, the silence felt heavier than before. Lily sat quietly at the table, looking down at her hands as though she was worried she had done something wrong. I reached over and gently squeezed her shoulder. "You were honest," I said softly. "That takes courage." She nodded faintly, though her eyes were still filled with uncertainty. Children often carry emotions for years because they believe adults are too busy to hear them. What Lily had spoken aloud was not anger. It was longing. A longing for attention, presence, and connection. My son leaned back in his chair and covered his face briefly with his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded tired and reflective. "I should have noticed sooner," he admitted. "I kept telling myself we were building a good life for her." I understood exactly what he meant. Many parents believe providing comfort, opportunities, and security automatically means they're giving their children everything they need. But children measure love differently. They notice who shows up, who listens, and who makes them feel important. The attorney quietly gathered the documents, sensing that the legal discussion had become secondary to the family conversation unfolding around the table. One by one, relatives began speaking more openly. Not to criticize Vanessa, but to acknowledge truths they had previously ignored. An aunt admitted she had often seen Vanessa rushing through family events while managing business calls. A cousin mentioned that Theodore sometimes looked disappointed after gatherings, though he rarely explained why. Another relative recalled how Theodore always made time for conversations with the grandchildren, no matter how busy he was. The pattern became impossible to dismiss. Theodore's trust and letter were not punishments. They were warnings. He had recognized a danger that many successful families face, the slow replacement of connection with performance. After a while, the meeting ended. People left quietly, carrying their own thoughts and emotions into the rainy afternoon. I stayed behind for a few minutes with Lily. She looked worried again. "Is Mom mad at me?" she asked. "No," I said gently. "I think she is hurt because she realizes she missed things that mattered to you." Lily nodded slowly. "I did not want to hurt her." "Sometimes the truth hurts before it heals," I replied. When we returned to the estate later that evening, the house felt different than it had after Theodore's funeral. Grief was still there, but now another emotion had entered the room: honesty. The carefully maintained image of our family had cracked open, revealing conversations that should have happened years earlier. Vanessa did not come home until late. I heard her enter quietly and walk upstairs without speaking to anyone. The next morning, I found her sitting alone in the sunroom, holding an old photo album. She looked exhausted, but not from lack of sleep. She looked exhausted from seeing herself clearly for the first time. Several photographs were spread across the table. Birthday parties, school events, vacations, holidays. In many of them, Vanessa was present physically but distracted emotionally. Phone in hand. Looking away. Speaking to someone else. The realization seemed to be hitting her all at once. "I thought I was doing everything for my family," she said quietly without looking up. I sat across from her and answered honestly. "You were doing many things for your family. But not always the things they needed most." Tears filled her eyes again. I did not realize how lonely Lily felt. Most people do not notice what they are missing until someone finally says it out loud. She closed the album slowly. "The inheritance is not what hurts right now." I nodded. "I know." And in that moment, I understood something important. Theodore's greatest concern had never been the money itself. He had worried that our family was losing the ability to see one another clearly. The will reading had revealed financial arrangements, but Lily's words had revealed something far more painful. Vanessa had not only lost part of an inheritance. She had discovered how much of her daughter's childhood she had almost lost too. Part 7, Losing What Money Cannot Replace. The days that followed felt different from anything our family had experienced before. For years, life had moved at a relentless pace, filled with schedules, obligations, meetings, and expectations. Now, for the first time, everything seemed to slow down. Vanessa no longer spent her mornings rushing between calls and appointments. Instead, she spent long hours alone, reflecting on conversations she could no longer ignore. One afternoon, nearly 2 weeks after the will reading, I found her sitting in Theodore's old study. The room had always been his favorite place in the house. Shelves lined with books surrounded her, and dozens of framed family photographs rested on the desk. She was quietly sorting through them one by one. As I approached, she picked up a photograph from 10 years earlier. It showed Lily at a school art fair, proudly holding a ribbon beside one of her paintings. Vanessa stared at the picture for several seconds before speaking. "I barely remember that day," she admitted. Her voice carried a sadness I had never heard before. "I remember the client meeting afterward. I remember the contract we signed. But I barely remember this." She looked at the smiling child in the photograph. "Lily probably remembers every detail." I sat across from her without saying anything. Sometimes people need silence more than advice. Vanessa continued turning pages. Every photograph seemed to reveal another forgotten memory. Family picnics. Holiday dinners. School performances. Birthday celebrations. In each image, she could see the moment she had attended physically but never fully experienced emotionally. The realization was becoming impossible to escape. Theodore had not been trying to punish her. He had been trying to warn her. Several days later, Lily had a weekend soccer game. Normally, Vanessa would arrive late or leave early if she attended at all. This time was different. She arrived before the game started. She sat in the bleachers without her phone in her hand. She watched every minute. She cheered for every player, not just her daughter. When the game ended, Lily looked almost surprised to find her mother still sitting there waiting. The smile that appeared on her face was small, but it was genuine. It reminded me that trust can begin returning long before it is fully restored. Yet rebuilding relationships proved more difficult than simply showing up. The wounds created by years of emotional distance could not disappear overnight. One evening, I overheard Vanessa speaking with my son in the kitchen. "I thought success would give our family everything," she said quietly. "Now I realize I spent so much time building a future that I missed parts of the present." My son nodded. "You are not the only one." It was an important admission. Theodore's concerns had never belonged to one person alone. Many members of the family had become distracted by achievement. Vanessa simply happened to be the first force to confront it directly. Over the following month, family gatherings became more meaningful. Conversations lasted longer. Phones appeared less often. People listened more carefully. Slowly, Theodore's final lesson was beginning to influence everyone. Then one evening, as the sun set over the estate, Vanessa approached me while I was sitting on the back porch. She seemed nervous, which was unusual for her. For years she had always appeared confident, certain, and in control. Now she looked vulnerable. She sat beside me and stared out toward the oak trees. "I owe you an apology," she said quietly. I listened without interrupting. For years, I treated this family like something that would always be there no matter how little attention I gave it. I worried about appearances, money, and status because I thought those things would protect us. But Theodore understood something I did not. Her eyes filled with tears. The thing I was most afraid of losing was never the inheritance. She paused before continuing. It was the trust of the people who loved me. And I almost lost it. The honesty in her voice surprised me. For the first time since I had known her, there was no performance, no carefully managed image, and no attempt to impress anyone. There was only truth. After a long silence, she finally turned toward me. "I do not know how to fix all of this," she admitted. "But I want to try." Then she asked a question that I never expected to hear from her. "Will you help me rebuild this family?" Part 8, Earning Back What Matters. I looked at Vanessa for several moments before answering her question. The woman sitting beside me on the porch was very different from the person who had walked into the attorney's office expecting everything to go according to plan. The confidence was still there, but it had been replaced by humility. The ambition remained, but it no longer seemed to control every decision. Most importantly, she was finally willing to listen. "Yes," I said quietly. "I will help you. But rebuilding trust takes time." Vanessa nodded immediately. "I understand." And for perhaps the first time in many years, I believed she truly did. The months that followed were not marked by dramatic gestures or grand announcements. Instead, they were filled with small decisions. The kind of decisions that slowly change a person's life. Vanessa began spending more time with Lily. Not because anyone instructed her to do so, but because she genuinely wanted to. She attended school events without checking her phone every few minutes. She helped with homework. She listened to stories about teachers, friends, and ordinary moments that she once would have considered unimportant. At first, Lily seemed cautious. Children are often willing to forgive, but they learn to protect themselves when disappointment becomes familiar. She appreciated the changes, yet she watched carefully to see whether they would last. Vanessa understood this. She did not demand immediate trust. She simply continued showing up. One Saturday afternoon, I watched them spend 3 hours baking cupcakes together in the kitchen. The process was messy and imperfect. Flour ended up on the counter. Frosting ended up on their faces. Both of them laughed more during those 3 hours than they had during some entire months in the past. Later that evening, Lily proudly carried a tray of cupcakes into the dining room and announced that her mother had let her design every decoration herself. It seemed like a small moment, yet I knew Theodore would have loved it. The changes extended beyond Lily as well. Vanessa started participating more actively in family gatherings. Instead of arriving late and leaving early, she stayed. She asked questions. She listened to stories. She learned details about relatives she had known for years but never truly understood. Several family members remained cautious at first. Trust, once damaged, rarely returns overnight. Yet people gradually noticed that her behavior was becoming consistent. Weeks turned into months. The effort continued. The conversations deepened. Slowly, the distance that had existed within the family began to shrink. One evening during a holiday dinner, my son pulled me aside. "She is really trying," he said quietly. I smiled. Trying is where every meaningful change begins. Meanwhile, Theodore's trust continued operating exactly as he intended. Family members participated in discussions regarding charitable projects, educational opportunities, and long-term planning. The structure encouraged collaboration rather than competition. Surprisingly, even those who initially questioned the arrangement began appreciating its purpose. Theodore had created something far more valuable than a financial system. He had created a reason for the family to remain connected. As spring arrived once again, nearly a year had passed since the wool reading. The estate looked beautiful beneath the fresh green leaves returning to the oak trees. Plans were underway for a large family gathering to celebrate Lily's upcoming birthday. Unlike previous years, the excitement centered less on decorations and gifts and more on simply being together. A few days before the celebration, Vanessa visited me in the garden. We walked slowly along the stone path Theodore had built decades earlier. "I used to think respect came from success," she admitted. "Now I know it comes from consistency." I nodded. "And what else have you learned?" She smiled softly. "That relationships cannot be inherited. They have to be earned." Her answer made me think of Theodore's letter. Everything he hoped the family would understand was finally beginning to take root. As we continued walking through the garden, surrounded by blooming flowers and warm sunlight, I realized that the coming family gathering would be unlike any we had experienced before. Not because of the estate. Not because of the trust. And certainly not because of money. It would be different because, for the first time in years, everyone was beginning to understand what truly mattered. Part 9, Theodore's Real Legacy. The day of Lily's birthday arrived beneath a clear summer sky. Warm sunlight filtered through the giant oak tree surrounding the Whitmore estate, and for the first time in a very long while, the atmosphere felt genuinely peaceful. Long tables were arranged across the lawn, decorated with flowers from the garden and photographs collected from different generations of the family. Children laughed as they ran through the grass. Relatives gathered beneath the shade of the trees, sharing stories, meals, and memories. As I stood on the terrace overlooking the celebration, I found myself thinking about Theodore. Nearly every corner of the estate carried some reminder of him. Yet instead of sadness, I felt gratitude. His absence would always be felt, but his influence remained everywhere. Lily was at the center of the gathering, smiling brighter than I had seen her smile in years. What caught my attention most was not her happiness alone but the person standing beside her. Vanessa spent the afternoon helping decorate cupcakes, organizing games, and listening attentively whenever Lily spoke. There was no phone in her hand. No distractions. No urgent business conversations pulling her attention elsewhere. She was fully present. At one point, Lily wrapped her arms around her mother and whispered something that made both of them laugh. The moment lasted only a few seconds, yet it represented months of effort, honesty, and growth. Trust had not returned instantly. It had returned gradually, built one conversation and one choice at a time. Several relatives noticed the change as well. Throughout the afternoon, family members who once kept their distance now spoke comfortably with Vanessa. The caution that had existed after the will reading had slowly faded. Not because people had forgotten the past, but because they had witnessed consistent change. Real transformation rarely happens through words alone. It happens through actions repeated over time. Later that evening, as the sun began sinking toward the horizon, everyone gathered near the garden for dessert. The golden light illuminated the estate in a way Theodore always loved. My son raised a glass and thanked everyone for coming. Then he paused and looked around at the family surrounding him. "Dad would have loved this," he said quietly. Heads nodded throughout the crowd. For a moment, nobody spoke. We were all thinking the same thing. Theodore had spent his final years worrying that the family was drifting apart. Somehow, through wisdom and careful planning, he had brought everyone closer together after he was gone. As the gathering continued, Vanessa walked over and sat beside me. We watched Lily laughing with cousins near the oak trees. "I used to think the most important part of the inheritance was the money," she admitted softly. "Now I understand how wrong I was." I smiled gently. "What do you think the inheritance really was?" She looked across the lawn at the people gathered together. "This," she answered. "The chance to become the kind of family Theodore hoped we could be." Her words stayed with me long after the celebration ended. As darkness settled over the estate and guests slowly began heading home, I walked alone through the garden Theodore had loved so much. I thought about the trust, the letter, the difficult conversations, and the painful truths that had emerged. In the end, none of those things were truly about money. They were about perspective. Theodore understood something many people never learn. Wealth can provide comfort, opportunity, and security, but it cannot replace presence. It cannot purchase trust. It cannot create meaningful relationships. Those things must be earned through love, attention, and daily choices. That was the real legacy he left behind. And the greatest lesson of all was simple. An inheritance measured in dollars can be spent. An inheritance built on character, family, and genuine connection can last for generations.